Welcome, dear listener. Take a slow, deep breath and allow yourself to settle into a space of quiet reflection. Perhaps you are lying in bed, the light dimmed, the world beginning to soften around the edges. Let the hum of the present fade gently into the background, and join me now as we drift backward in time through 5 centuries of dust and memory into the world of Tudor England. This was an age of towering monarchs and sweeping religious upheaval, of wooden beams and candlelit shadows, a time when life was short and expectations were rigid. Much about Tudor life may appear quaint from our modern vantage point: corseted gowns, lutes playing in the hall, the scent of rushes on the floor. But beneath the surface lay harsher realities, and among them, few things were more fraught, more tangled in silence and suffering, than the act we might consider the most intimate: S3X. In this script, we will take our time quietly and carefully to explore the hidden world of sexual experience in Tudor England, especially as it was lived and endured by women. This will not be a tale of scandalous affairs or ribald gossip. Instead, it will be a slow and thoughtful journey into the societal expectations, cultural anxieties, medical beliefs, and personal consequences tied to this most human of acts, in an era where silence, shame, and survival were closely intertwined. Let's begin, not in the royal courts or the pages of scandalous literature, but somewhere quieter, simpler and, in many ways, far more telling. Imagine yourself waking in a small wooden cottage on the edge of a Tudor village. The thatched roof creaks faintly above you as the wind moves through the chimney. Your mattress is stuffed with straw, your coverlet is coarse wool, and beside you, the dull grey light of morning seeps in through a shuttered window. If you are a woman, your life is already defined before your first step of the day. From birth, your body has not been truly your own. Not legally, not spiritually, not even biologically, according to the medical wisdom of the day. In Tudor England, a woman's role was shaped by a trifecta of authority: the church, the crown, and male kin. These forces formed the tight circle within which her choice, especially regarding S3X and marriage, could exist. Girls were raised to be obedient, quiet, and useful. From a very early age, they were taught that their future depended almost entirely on their chastity. Virginity was not just a virtue, it was capital. The mere suggestion that a girl might have been spoiled, whether true or not, could ruin her marriage prospects, her family standing, and her own security. In a world without social safety nets, this could mean destitution or worse. It is important to remember that most people did not marry for love. Marriage was economic, social, and religious. And for women, it was deeply tied to their survival. Once married, a woman was expected to submit to her husband. Legally, her body became his property. This was not metaphor, it was written into law. A husband had the right to demand intercourse. And while certain forms of extreme abuse might draw attention, the concept of marital consent did not exist as we understand it today. The expectation to bear children was immediate and continuous. A woman who failed to produce heirs might be blamed, pitied, or even cast aside. Yet pregnancy was far from a gentle prospect. Maternal mortality was common, pain relief was non-existent, and medical care, such as it was based on deeply flawed understandings of the body. Women were often told that their wombs were unstable, liable to wander if not regularly used for reproduction. S3X, it was believed, was necessary to keep the female body balanced. At the same time, women were warned to remain passive, lest they appear wanton or lustful. This contradiction between duty and purity, submission and suspicion haunted even the most ordinary lives. If a woman conceived out of wedlock, the consequences could be severe. She might be punished publicly, whipped through the streets, or branded as a warning to others. And yet, in a deeply patriarchal world, the man involved could often walk away with little more than a stain on his reputation, if even that. Women's knowledge of their own bodies was limited by design. Education was sparse, and discussion of anatomy was couched in euphemism. The church emphasized modesty and sin, reinforcing the idea that S3s even within marriage was dirty, shameful, or at best a necessary evil. In quiet kitchens and darkened birthing rooms, knowledge was passed down woman to woman: herbal remedies, whispered warnings, folk wisdom about how to conceive or how to avoid it. But even these fragments of power were precarious. A woman who knew too much risked accusations of witchcraft, especially if she practiced midwifery or healing. Through all this, life went on. Bread was baked, floors swept, children raised. But behind the quiet rhythms of domestic life lay an ever-present awareness of vulnerability. S3X was rarely a source of pleasure. It was more often a duty, a risk, or a burden, carried out in silence, under the weight of expectation. And yet, women found ways to endure. They formed bonds with one another, shared what they could, and navigated a world that offered few choices and fewer protections. In their silence was strength. In their survival was a quiet form of rebellion. As we leave this small cottage behind and walk slowly into the wider structures of Tudor society, we carry with us the image of a woman sweeping her threshold, the hearth flickering behind her. She knows her place in the world, but she also knows far more than she is ever allowed to say. Now, let us step away from the modest village lane and into the polished stone halls of palaces' green velvet drapes, gold-threaded tapestries, and flickering candlelight along corridors once walked by kings and queens. You might imagine that the lives of noble women and royals, especially queens, were cushioned by luxury, far removed from the grim realities faced by common women. But in Tudor England, power did not exempt women from the burdens of sexuality. In many ways, it intensified them. The stakes were higher, the scrutiny sharper, and the consequences more publicly devastating. Few figures embody this better than Anne Boleyn. She is perhaps the most famous woman of her time, yet her rise and fall can be traced along the narrow path laid out by sexual expectation. Anne was not born into royalty, but she captivated Henry VIII with her wit, her boldness, and yes, her refusal to become his mistress. She withheld intimacy, and in doing so, turned her chastity into a kind of leverage, perhaps the only kind a woman could wield in a world governed by men. But that leverage was always fragile. Once Anne became queen, her value became singular. She was expected to bear a male heir. When she failed to do so, the same court that once admired her turned cold. Rumours swirled, political enemies whispered, and soon she was accused of adultery, incest, and treason. The charges were almost certainly false, but they gave Henry the pretext he needed. In 1536, Anne was executed. Her downfall was swift and brutal, a clear reminder that even queens could be discarded if they no longer served their sexual or reproductive purpose. Catherine Howard, another of Henry's queens, met a similar fate. Only a teenager when she married the aging king, Catherine was lively and affectionate, traits that in other times might have been endearing. But in the Tudor court, they made her dangerous. When her past flirtations and relationships came to light, she was accused of unchaste behaviour, both before and during her marriage. She was executed at the Tower of London at just 17. Her final words were a plea for mercy and remembrance, delivered not as a queen, but as a frightened girl. These stories are not mere court gossip. They reflect a deeper truth about the role of sex and gender in Tudor power structures. A woman's body, especially a royal woman's, was a vessel for lineage, legitimacy, and diplomacy. Her chastity could shape alliances, her fertility could secure dynasties, and her perceived transgressions could upend entire kingdoms. Even those who survived the court's treacherous waters, such as Elizabeth I, were not free from these pressures. The so-called Virgin Queen used her unmarried status as a political shield, refusing to be defined by any man. Yet this choice brought its own burdens. Rumours of lovers clung to her reputation, and foreign powers viewed her singleness with suspicion. Still, Elizabeth wielded her sexuality not through indulgence, but through calculated restraint. Her body, her image, and her myth were all tools of statecraft. For noble women just below the crown, the story was much the same, albeit with fewer protections. Marriages were arranged early, often as teenagers, to secure family alliances. Girls were prized for their purity and silence. Once married, they were expected to produce sons quickly. If they didn't, they might be sent to convents, exiled to country estates, or quietly replaced. Affairs and dalliances did happen, but for women, the risks were always steeper. While some men carried on with little consequence, a woman discovered in an affair risked ruin or worse. Love, for women in power, was rarely simple. It was a currency, a threat, and sometimes a weapon. Behind the grand banquets, the embroidered gowns, and the courtly dances, there was constant calculation. Every glance, Every touch, every child carried political weight. For women, intimacy was never just personal, it was public, politicized, and perilous. As we leave the palace and return to the wider tapestry of Tudor society, let us carry with us this quiet understanding. Whether peasant or queen, a woman's sexual life in Tudor England was never truly her own. It was governed by others, spoken about in whispers, and judged by standards that were impossibly rigid and often cruel. And now, having examined the grand stage of royal power, we shall gently descend into another realm more hidden, more uncertain, the world of Tudor medicine, folk beliefs, and the strange, often unsettling theories surrounding the body and its functions. Let us now step into a quieter room, cool, dim, and lined with wooden shelves holding jars of herbs, powders, and tinctures. There is the faint scent of dried rosemary and old parchment. A midwife leans over a small table, muttering softly as she grinds valerian root in a mortar. Nearby, a young woman clutches her belly in silence. Her discomfort is met not with certainty, but with ritual, guesswork, and deeply flawed science. In Tudor England, the understanding of the human body, especially the female body, was based less on anatomy than on centuries of inherited beliefs. Medical knowledge still drew heavily from the ancient texts of Galen and Hippocrates, filtered through medieval interpretations. These teachings shaped every experience a woman had with her body, from menstruation and fertility to pleasure, pain, and death. The prevailing theory of the time was the humoral system. According to this view, the human body was made up of 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health was thought to depend on keeping these elements in balance. Too much black bile, for example, might make one melancholic. Too much blood, overly passionate. For women, imbalance was frequently assumed, and menstruation was seen as a natural means of purging excess humors. If a woman did not menstruate, she might be diagnosed as blocked, overheated, or even hysterical. Oh, the womb in particular was the subject of much curiosity and many myths. It was thought to be a mobile organ, capable of wandering throughout the body, causing various ailments depending on where it lodged. Headaches, seizures, and fainting spells were often blamed on a displaced womb. Treatments ranged from fumigation with aromatic herbs to more invasive methods, none of them grounded in actual anatomy. Midwives and female healers held much of the practical knowledge about childbirth and women's health. These women walked a delicate line, respected for their wisdom, but also suspected, especially in times of loss or complication. If a birth went badly, if a child died, or if a woman suffered complications, the midwife might be accused of negligence or worse, witchcraft. Doctors, most of whom were men, rarely examined women directly. Modesty and religious decorum often meant that diagnoses were made from a distance or through intermediaries. Medical texts described female anatomy in vague and euphemistic terms, often casting it as an inversion of the male form. The female body, in this framework, was passive, porous, and dangerously unpredictable. Pleasure was another mystery. While male desire was considered natural and necessary, female desire was treated with suspicion. Some physicians argued that women could not conceive unless they experienced orgasm. Others warned that female pleasure was a sign of moral decay. The conflicting beliefs left women trapped between silence and shame. Few would speak openly about their experiences, and fewer still had the language or agency to explore them. Contraception, while not widely discussed, was practiced in quiet corners. Herbal concoctions, barrier methods using animal membranes, and timing-based avoidance were all used, though none were especially reliable. These methods were usually passed down through word of mouth, taught discreetly between women, but they carried risks. If a woman was suspected of interfering with pregnancy, whether to avoid it or end it, she could face accusations of witchcraft or immorality. Pregnancy itself was a time of immense uncertainty. There were no tests, no ultrasounds, no sure signs beyond missed cycles and subtle symptoms. A woman might not know for weeks, even months. Miscarriages were common and poorly understood. Stillbirths were mourned but rarely spoken of. And should a woman die in childbirth, as many did, her fate was often seen as inevitable, part of the divine order. Pain relief was scarce. Labour was considered a punishment for Eve's transgression in the Garden of Eden. Women were told to suffer quietly, to pray, and to accept their pain as part of their natural role. Some herbal remedies might dull the edge, but true comfort was rare. In all of this strange blend of science, superstition, and silent's own constant remained. The female body was viewed not as its own domain, but as a mystery to be controlled, interpreted, or feared. Women were expected to endure, to comply, and to keep their questions to themselves. Yet even in these constrained spaces, women found quiet strength. They shared what knowledge they could. They tended to one another. They recorded remedies in the margins of cookbooks and passed down midwifery wisdom from mother to daughter. In whispered conversations by firelight, the legacy of feminine survival endured. And now, let us gently close the door on this world of tinctures and trembling diagnoses, and turn our attention outward toward the institutions that enforced, shaped, and judged sexual conduct. For in Tudor England, it was not only medicine that defined a woman's sexual life, but also the watchful eyes of the church and the harsh mechanisms of the law. Let us now imagine a hushed chapel at the heart of a Tudor town. Thick stone walls hold in the scent of candle wax and old wood. A priest stands at the pulpit, his voice calm but stern, echoing through pews filled with bowed heads. His sermon today is on sin, particularly the sins of the flesh. The congregation listens in silence, but the message is unmistakable. Sexuality, especially for women, was not a private matter. It was a moral question, a legal issue, and a subject of constant scrutiny. In Tudor England, the boundaries of right and wrong were not just dictated by custom, they were enforced by the state and the church in tandem. This was a time of great religious tension. The early 16th century saw the kingdom torn between Catholic tradition and Protestant reform. But while these factions clashed over doctrine, they largely agreed on one thing: sexuality must be tightly controlled. The church taught that sex was only permissible within marriage, and even then, it was not to be enjoyed too much. Pleasure for its own sake was viewed with suspicion, a possible sign of moral weakness. Sexual desire was associated with temptation, the devil, and the downfall of souls. Confession, repentance, and restraint were key. For women, this created a double burden. They were to be guardians of virtue, yet naturally suspect. Religious doctrine shaped laws in deeply personal ways. Adultery was not just a private failing, it was a public offense. Women caught in extramarital affairs could be punished. Severely public shaming, fines, imprisonment, even mutilation in extreme cases. Men, by contrast, often received lighter consequences unless the affair threatened property or lineage. Even within marriage, sexual conduct was regulated. There were rules about when couples could sleep together certain days of the week, and liturgical calendar were considered inappropriate. Sex during menstruation was forbidden, so was intercourse during periods of mourning or fasting. The idea was not only to limit pleasure, but to ensure that all intimacy remained under divine sanction. The ecclesiastical courts handled most cases of sexual misconduct. These were church-run legal institutions tasked with upholding moral order. A woman might be summoned if she gave birth out of wedlock. She would be made to confess publicly, sometimes kneeling in church wearing a white sheet or carrying a symbolic candle. The shame was deliberate, meant to correct and warn. Yet rarely was the man involved held to the same standard. The imbalance was not lost on the women themselves, but there were few avenues for protest. Even marriage itself required approval and formality. Secret marriages, or those made without a priest, could be declared invalid, casting doubt on the legitimacy of any children. And without legitimate heirs, women lost status, property rights, and protection. Prostitution was another area of tension. Though officially condemned, it was often tolerated in practice, particularly in urban centres like London or Southwark. Brothels might even be licensed, loosely overseen by officials. The rationale was paradoxical. It was better, some argued, for men to visit prostitutes than to seduce or assault respectable women. The women working in these houses, however, had little agency. Many were poor, abandoned, or coerced. Their lives were marked by disease, violence, and an ever-present threat of arrest. Punishments for sexual crimes were frequently public. A woman convicted of fornication might be paraded through the streets with her head shaved. Adulterers might be placed in the stocks or subjected to ritual humiliation. These ceremonies of shame served to reinforce community norms but also revealed a society deeply anxious about control. The poor, of course, suffered most. A servant girl found pregnant might be dismissed without reference. A widowed mother could find herself begging in the streets, her virtue questioned, her prospects gone. The wealthy might navigate the system with discretion and bribes, but ordinary women lived under constant watch. And yet, behind all this regulation and judgment, private lives still unfolded. Couples still fell in love. Letters were written in secret. Affections were expressed in glances, in hurried touches behind hedges, in clandestine meetings beneath staircases. Even within rigid structures, humanity found its way through. It is worth pausing here, in this space between law and love, to consider how exhausting it must have been for women in particular to live under such scrutiny, to know that every choice, every mistake, every whisper of impropriety could follow them for life, to feel desire and fear in equal measure. As we leave the courthouse and the cloister behind, let us turn now to the world beyond the institutions, the everyday culture of jokes, songs, and stories. For even in a world of silence and shame, popular culture found ways to speak the unspeakable. Now, let us step outside the stern walls of church and court, and into the cobbled streets where daily life unfolded with laughter, labour, and the quiet hum of survival. In bustling markets, smoky taverns, and the shadowed corners of alehouses, a different voice could be heard not written in laws or scriptures, but sung, joked, and whispered. This was the voice of the people, and it spoke of sex, not with solemnity or shame, but with earthy humour, sly innuendo, and knowing laughter. For all the official repression, Tudor England was not devoid of humour about sexuality. Quite the opposite. A rich vein of popular culture songs, plays, riddles, and poems wove sexual themes into their fabric. These expressions served multiple purposes. They entertained, bonded communities, and offered an outlet for frustrations in a world where so much was controlled and silenced. One of the most vivid sources of this culture was the broadside ballada kind of printed song sheet, sold cheaply and read or sung aloud in homes and inns. These ballads covered a wide range of topics, from political satire to romantic tales, and often they were laced with bawdy humour. Double meanings were common, with references to ploughing fields, ringing bells, or trimming bushes standing in for far more intimate acts. It was understood, even expected, that listeners would catch the joke, though always in a way that preserved a layer of plausible deniability. These songs were rarely kind to women. Many depicted them as either temptresses or fools, either dangerously seductive or hopelessly naive. Yet, within these caricatures, we find glimpses of the realities women faced, the pressure to remain chaste, the consequences of seduction, the risk of abandonment. Some ballads served as cautionary tales. Others simply reflected a society trying to reconcile its strict moral codes with the messy, ungovernable nature of desire. The theatre was another place where sexuality danced along the margins. Though women were barred from performing on stage, female roles were played by young boys. Tudor plays often dealt with themes of lust, betrayal, and mistaken identity. Cross-dressing plots, bed tricks, and bawdy servants were common devices, allowing playwrights to explore gender and desire in ways that were simultaneously comic and subversive. The works of Shakespeare, who came just after the Tudor era, but carried its sensibilities, are rich with such moments. Consider the playful banter between characters like Beatrice and Benedick, or the ribald jokes of Mercutio and the nurse in Romeo and Juliet. These were not merely jokes, they were acknowledgments of a world where love and lust did not fit neatly into the boxes imposed by religion or law. Riddles and folk tales, too, carried sexual themes. Some were innocent on the surface, but had meanings that adults understood all too well. They were shared at feasts, passed between friends, and whispered in corners. In a society that often demanded silence, humour was a safe space to acknowledge what everyone knew but dared not say. And yet, as with so much in Tudor life, this freedom was uneven. What passed as jest for a man might be seen as evidence of immorality in a woman. A bawdy joke from a male performer might win applause. A woman known to laugh too loudly could be deemed immodest. The double standards ran deep. Still, the very existence of this vibrant, suggestive culture shows that sexuality was not simply buried beneath shame. It lived on in song and story, in knowing glances and hidden meanings. It was not always joyful, often it was bitter, cruel, or mocking, but it was a way of speaking, of resisting silence. This cultural undercurrent reveals something important, that people, regardless of era, find ways to express themselves. Even under repression, even within fear, they make space for laughter, desire, and truth. It may be veiled, may wear the mask of humor, but it persists. As our journey continues, let us now turn back toward the private sphere, into the homes and hearths where sex had its most direct and intimate consequences. We will explore the emotional and physical costs borne by women, particularly in the wake of sexual transgression, and how these costs shape not only individual lives, but entire generations. Imagine now the hush of a modest Tudor cottage. The fire has died down, the embers glowing faintly beneath a thin layer of ash. A young woman sits in the corner, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her eyes dart to the door at every creak of the wood. Outside, the world continues, neighbours pass. Hens cluck in the yard, but inside, her world has narrowed to a single, all-consuming fear. This was the reality for many women in Tudor England, who found themselves on the wrong side of sexual expectation. Whether through coercion, misplaced trust, or sheer misfortune, the line between acceptable and ruinous behaviour was thin, and the punishment for crossing it was harsh, enduring, and deeply personal. A woman who became pregnant outside of marriage faced not only public disgrace but profound uncertainty about her future. She might be dismissed from service, cast out by her family, or brought before a parish court. Many women tried to conceal their pregnancies for as long as possible. In some cases, this led to desperate, tragic decisions, abandoning newborns, attempting unsafe abortions with herbal concoctions, or giving birth in secret. Records from the time reveal the grim outcomes of such secrecy. Coroners' reports and parish records describe concealed births, babies found in latrines, shallow graves, or hidden among straw in barns. These cases were often met with harsh judgment, but rarely with understanding. The circumstances, whether the result of assault, seduction, or fear, were seldom considered. The moral weight fell squarely on the mother. And yet, even within marriage, the consequences of sex could be deeply burdensome. Childbirth was dangerous. Each pregnancy carried with it the very real possibility of death. Complications such as prolonged labor, infection, or hemorrhage were common, and without antibiotics or surgical intervention, even minor issues could prove fatal. Some women gave birth 10 or more times during their lives, their bodies bearing the silent cost of reproductive duty. Surviving childbirth was not the end of the trial. The postnatal period, called lying in, was a time of enforced rest, during which women were expected to remain indoors for several weeks. It was also a spiritual cleansing. According to church custom, a woman had to undergo churching before she could return to public worship. This ritual, meant to give thanks for her survival, was also a subtle acknowledgement of impurity, the idea that childbirth, though necessary, left her in need of spiritual renewal. For widows and single mothers, the struggle was even harder. Without a husband's protection, they often lived in precarious conditions. Employment options were limited. They might spin wool, take in laundry, or work as wet nurses, but always with the shadow of judgment hanging over them. Some turned to sex work out of necessity, becoming further entangled in a cycle of stigma and survival. In wealthier households, the consequences were often more hidden but no less real. Noble women who failed to produce heirs could be quietly set aside, their marriages annulled or their lives relegated to quiet obscurity. Servants who became pregnant by their masters had little recourse, their reputations shattered, while the men walked free. Silence was often the only shield, though a fragile one. Yet despite all this, the Tudor home was not solely a place of sorrow, it was also a place of endurance. Women leaned on one another, sharing stories, advice, and sympathy. Midwives provided not only medical care, but emotional support. Mothers taught daughters how to navigate the tightrope of reputation. And sometimes, quietly, love did find a place, genuine affection growing within or alongside the rigid structures of arranged unions. Letters from the period, though rare for common women, show glimpses of tenderness and concern. A husband worrying for his wife's health during pregnancy. A mother writing to her daughter about the dangers of courtship. These fragments remind us that even within a culture of control and silence, The emotional landscape was rich, complex, and deeply human. We leave this domestic space now with a sense of weight off, the burdens carried, and the lives shaped by expectations often beyond one's control. But as we look toward the broader society, we will begin to understand how these private experiences fed into larger patterns of power, resistance, and historical change. Let us now step into a larger space, into the vaulted chambers of royal councils, echoing cathedrals, and the ink-stained desks of lawmakers and theologians. The private struggles we've explored so far did not exist in isolation. They were deeply affected by sweeping changes in Tudor society, especially during one of the most transformative movements in English history, the Reformation. At the heart of this period was a single, seismic event: King Henry VIII's break with the Roman Catholic Church. His desire to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, driven largely by her failure to produce a male heir, set into motion a complex unravelling of religious authority. By 1534, Henry had declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, effectively severing the country from papal control. This shift was more than political. It touched every aspect of life, including sexuality. The Catholic Church, for all its rigidity, had long served as the interpreter of moral law. Its doctrines governed not just belief but behaviour, particularly in matters of marriage, chastity, and sexual conduct. With the dissolution of monasteries and the rise of Protestantism, many of these traditional structures were swept away, but they were not replaced with leniency. Instead, new moral frameworks emerged, often stricter, more suspicious, and more punitive. One key difference lay in the loss of religious intermediaries. Under Catholicism, sin could be confessed and absolved by a priest. There was room, at least in theory, for repentance and redemption. But Protestant reformers placed more emphasis on personal morality and community surveillance. Parishioners were encouraged to monitor one another's behaviour. Sexual transgressions were no longer just a matter between the individual and God. They became public failings, reflective of spiritual weakness and social disorder. This gave rise to a culture of scrutiny. Church wardens, elders, and even neighbours were empowered to report impropriety. A woman seen visiting a man's home alone, or a couple who married too quickly after announcing their bans, might be investigated. The church courts remained active, but their tone had shifted. The emphasis was now on reforming behaviour through shame and punishment. Alongside these changes came new laws. The Tudor state increasingly involved itself in matters of marriage and family, reflecting a growing interest in order and stability. Bastardy laws were tightened, inheritance rules clarified, and punishments for fornication and adultery more systematically enforced. These laws disproportionately affected the poor, who had less ability to hide or evade them. One of the more visible examples of this shift was the regulation of sexuality among the clergy. Under Catholic rule, priests were expected to remain celibate, but Protestant reforms allowed, and in some cases encouraged, clerical marriage. This was seen as a moral good proof of a minister's upright character and ability to lead a household, yet it also placed a spotlight on their private lives. Ministers' wives became public symbols of propriety, their conduct closely watched as extensions of their husband's virtue. The closing of monasteries also had unexpected consequences for women. For centuries, convents had offered a rare refuge for those who did not wish to marry or bear children. With their dissolution, many women lost that option. The expectation to marry and reproduce became nearly universal, with few acceptable alternatives. Education, too, was affected. Protestantism placed great value on personal Bible reading, which meant that literacy once largely restricted to the clergy and elite began to expand. Some women, particularly in Protestant households, gained access to books and religious texts. This was not liberation in a modern sense, but it did open quiet pathways to knowledge and reflection. Among the upper classes, the shift in morality was often accompanied by even greater control. Courtiers and nobles found their private lives under constant observation. A scandal could ruin not just an individual but an entire family. Marriage alliances became even more strategic, and sexual discretion more crucial than ever. Love was rarely the point survival was. In the countryside and among the lower orders, the changes were felt differently. While few would have read theological treatises, they certainly experienced the consequences of new laws, changing sermons, and the loss of older traditions. Folk customs involving fertility, seasonal rites, and symbolic sexuality came under suspicion. The body, once central to rural rituals and community life, was increasingly seen as something to be managed and restrained. And yet, people adapted. They whispered their stories, sang their songs, and shaped new traditions in the spaces left behind by reform. The human experience of love, longing, and desire did not vanish, it simply changed shape, finding new ways to persist within shifting structures. As we prepare to close our journey, let us pause one more time, this time to reflect on how all these threads came together in the final years of the Tudor era. For in that twilight, we begin to see the roots of modern ideas about sex, gender, and the body still tangled, still unresolved, but unmistakably emerging. The fire has burned low in the hearth of Tudor history, and as the coals flicker in their final glow, we find ourselves in the waning days of the 16th century. The reign of Elizabeth I is drawing to a close. The old houses of power, Boleyn, Seymour, Howard have risen and fallen. Religious tides have shifted. Wars have been fought. Lives have been lived quietly, and others noisily extinguished. And yet, in the silent corners of this period, something lingers. Something not written in statutes or stitched into royal banners, but carried in custom, in speech, in the quiet rhythm of daily life. The way Tudor England approached sex and womanhood did not simply vanish with the death of a queen. Much of it echoed forward, sometimes subtly, sometimes thunderously, into the world that followed. You may ask yourself, why should it matter? Why should the fears, beliefs, and customs of 16th century people concern us now? Because we still live with the residue of these ideas. Because how a society defines morality, shame, and bodily autonomy does not disappear when the century ends. It embeds itself in institutions, in expectations, in language. Let us gently trace some of those threads. The idea of the fallen woman, for example, a concept that continued well into the Victorian era and beyond as roots in Tudor sensibilities. A woman who bore a child out of wedlock, who expressed her own desire, or who simply misstepped in the careful dance of modesty and submission, could find herself defined not by her personhood, but by a perceived moral flaw. The Church's early enforcement of public penance and the legal weight given to female chastity created a precedent, one that taught society to measure a woman's worth by her sexual purity. This carried over into literature, law, and even medicine for centuries. Women's bodies were examined, metaphorically and literally, for signs of sin. Virginity, once a marker of social capital in Tudor marriage markets, would go on to be mythologized in ways that still shape our cultural assumptions today. The control of reproduction, too, was shaped by Tudor precedent. The lack of female agency over childbearing, enforced by religious doctrine and legal structure, laid the groundwork for future debates on birth control, consent, and bodily autonomy. The absence of formal sex education, the mystification of female anatomy, and the criminalization of abortion and contraception, these did not begin with the Tudors, but they were certainly codified during this era. Even our language bears traces of Tudor discomfort with desire. Words like shame, modesty, virtue, and sin were all actively employed to regulate behavior, especially female behavior. And though these words have softened over time, their echoes are not hard to find in modern debates around gender roles, sexuality, and reproductive rights. The enduring link between sexuality and morality, particularly as applied to women, has proven remarkably resilient. And perhaps this is the quiet tragedy of Tudor sexual culture. Not that it existed in a time of harshness we expect that from the past, but that so many of its logics still subtly persist. But there is another legacy too, one not of control, but of resistance. The stories of women who endured, who whispered their truths to one another, who recorded remedies in the margins of cookbooks, who defied expectation in silence or with small, steady acts of agency. These stories endure too. The Tudor world was not monolithic. It was full of contradictions, of people navigating harsh norms with nuance, with cleverness, with the tools they had. A woman who married for survival but found space for affection. A servant girl who bore a child in secret and raised it in defiance of shame. A midwife who passed down forbidden knowledge, not out of rebellion, but because women needed each other. These lives may not fill the history books the way monarchs and ministers do, but they shape the deeper history, the history of how people actually lived, felt, and adapted. And perhaps, As we now begin to ease ourselves out of this world, we can carry a gentler understanding with us, that history is not simply a catalogue of events, but a record of human experience, often painful, sometimes unjust, but always marked by the resilience of those who bore it. Let us now slip quietly from the candlelit Tudor home back into our present lives. The air feels different, lighter, cleaner, quieter. There is no law demanding a marriage match, no parish court recording our mistakes, no whispered threats of disgrace behind every decision. We live in a different world, not perfect but freer, and so, as you drift now towards sleep, let the echoes of the past settle softly in your thoughts. The struggles of those who came before do not need to haunt us, but they do deserve to be remembered. With care, with calm, with kindness. Good night.